I stood alone at the back of the grand ballroom, clutching my corsage with trembling fingers. The minister's voice echoed through the elegant space as he reached the traditional moment in the ceremony. Who gives this man away? My heart stopped. This was my moment. The moment I'd dreamed about since Michael was born 28 years ago. I took a small step forward, ready to speak the words I'd practiced in my mirror that morning. But my ex-husband Harold strode confidently toward the altar instead, his arm linked with his new wife Samantha. They both beamed with pride as if Michael was their son alone. "We do," Harold announced loudly, his voice carrying across the silent room. 300 guests turned to smile at them. Not one person looked back at me. The minister nodded approvingly. "Thank you, Harold and Samantha Hill, for raising such a fine young man." I felt the blood drain from my face. Samantha Hill. The woman who'd entered Michael's life 3 years ago was being credited with raising the son I'd sacrificed everything for. The son I'd worked 2 jobs to put through college while Harold spent our savings on his midlife crisis sports car. That was the moment I realized I'd become a stranger at my own son's wedding. "My name is Margaret Hill, and I need to ask you a favor. Please write in the comments where you're watching me from, and don't forget to subscribe." What I'm about to share with you is something I never thought could happen in my own family, under my own roof. This is a story about trust, betrayal, and the kind of evil that hides behind a smile. That was the day my son made me a stranger in his life. I walked out of the reception hall in silence, my heels clicking against the marble floor as conversations and laughter continued behind me. Nobody noticed me leaving. Nobody called my name or asked where I was going. In the parking lot, I carefully placed my corsage in the trash can beside my car. The small white flowers I'd chosen to match my dress. The dress I'd bought specifically because Michael once said I looked pretty in blue. Disappeared beneath crumpled napkins and empty coffee cups. As I drove away in the rain, my windshield wipers beating a steady rhythm, I glanced toward the house I'd once called home. The house where Harold now lived with Samantha, where they'd hosted the rehearsal dinner I wasn't invited to. Light spilled from every window, and I could hear laughter echoing across the manicured lawn I used to tend. But they'd forgotten something important about that house. Something that would change everything. The memory hit me as I sat in my small apartment, still wearing my wedding dress from hours earlier. 20 years ago, when Michael was 8 and desperately wanted to join the travel baseball team. "Mom, all the guys are doing it," he'd pleaded, showing me the registration forms. "Coach says I'm good enough to play at the next level." I'd looked at the fees, $5,000 for the season, plus equipment, plus travel expenses, and felt my heart sink. Harold had just bought his second motorcycle that year, claiming he needed it for stress relief from his accounting job. "We can't afford it, sweetheart," I'd said gently. But Michael's face had crumpled with such disappointment that I'd stayed up all night figuring out how to make it work. I'd taken a second job cleaning offices, working from 6 p.m. to midnight after my day's shift at the bank. For 3 months, I'd survived on 4 hours of sleep so my son could chase his dreams. Harold had barely noticed I was gone, too busy polishing his motorcycles to wonder why I looked exhausted. "We agreed you'd handle school and activities," he'd said when I'd asked for help with the fees. "We agreed to raise our son together," I'd replied. "We agreed you'd stop nagging," he'd sneered, walking away. But young Michael had hugged me tight after every game. "I'll never forget everything you've done for me, Mom." The divorce proceedings had been brutal, but I'd been smarter than Harold gave me credit for. While he'd focused on keeping his precious motorcycles and boat, I'd paid attention to the property settlement. Our lawyer had explained the options. We could sell the house and split the proceeds, or one of us could buy out the other's share. Harold had assumed I'd take the money and disappear quietly, but I'd added one crucial line to the property agreement before signing. Half the estate remains in Margaret Hill's name until death or voluntary transfer. Harold had barely glanced at the document, too eager to get me out of his life to read the fine print. "Fine," he'd said, scrawling his signature. "You'll never use it anyway. You're too scared to fight for anything." I'd smiled and signed my name carefully below his. "We'll see about that." The lawyer had raised his eyebrows at my addition, but it was completely legal. Harold was getting the house, but I was retaining ownership of 50% of its value. At the time, I'd thought of it as insurance, a safety net in case I ever needed money for emergencies. I'd never imagined I'd use it as a weapon. But as I sat in my lonely apartment, thinking about how I'd been erased from my son's most important day, that property clause suddenly felt like the most powerful tool I'd ever possessed. The wedding reception had been even worse than the ceremony. I'd been seated at a corner table with distant cousins I'd met twice, and Harold's elderly aunt who spent the entire evening complaining about the music volume. A waiter had approached during cocktail hour, looking confused. "Excuse me, ma'am, are you with the bride's family or the groom's family? I need to know which section to seat you in." "I'm with the groom's family," I'd said quietly. "I'm his mother." The young man had looked at his seating chart, then back at me with genuine confusion. "I'm sorry, but the groom's mother is listed as Samantha Hill. Are you sure you're at the right reception?" The words had hit me like a physical blow. On my son's wedding day, even the staff had been told that another woman was his mother. "There must be some mistake," I'd whispered. But there hadn't been a mistake. It had been a deliberate erasure. Later, I'd overheard Lauren talking to her bridesmaids near the bathroom. "Can you believe she wore that dress? It's so dated. And the way she keeps trying to insert herself into conversations. It's embarrassing." "Who is she again?" one of the bridesmaids had asked. "Michael's biological mother. But don't worry about her, she's not important. Harold and Samantha are the real parents now." I'd stood frozen behind the bathroom door, listening to them laugh about my irrelevance. When the DJ announced it was time for toasts, I'd felt a flicker of hope. Surely this would be my moment to speak about the son I'd raised, to share memories of his childhood, to publicly acknowledge the bond we'd once shared. I'd raised my hand when he asked if anyone else wanted to say a few words. But Lauren had immediately stepped forward, her designer dress sparkling under the ballroom lights. "I think we're done with speeches," she'd announced with a bright smile. "We don't want to keep people from dancing too long." The crowd had laughed politely, eager to move on to the party portion of the evening. I'd slowly lowered my hand, my face burning with humiliation. Around me, wedding guests had already started moving toward the dance floor, chatting about how lovely the ceremony had been, how beautiful Lauren looked, how lucky Harold and Samantha were to have such a wonderful son. Nobody mentioned the woman who'd actually raised Michael. Nobody mentioned the sacrifices, the sleepless nights, the years of working multiple jobs to give him every opportunity. Nobody mentioned me at all. I'd sat in my corner chair, trembling but trying to maintain my composure, and whispered to myself, "That's the last time you silence me." The words had felt like a promise, though I hadn't yet known what I was promising to do. Late that night, I'd driven slowly through my old neighborhood, past the house where I'd lived for 15 years. The house where I'd raised Michael from toddler to teenager, where I'd helped him with homework at the kitchen table, where I'd kissed scraped knees and celebrated good report cards. Harold's BMW and Samantha's Mercedes were in the driveway, along with several other expensive cars belonging to wedding guests who'd been invited to the after-party I wasn't welcome at. Through the large windows I'd once hung curtains in, I could see people laughing and drinking champagne. Harold was holding court in what used to be my living room, probably telling stories about his successful business and wonderful family life. My replacement, Samantha, was playing hostess in the kitchen where I'd packed thousands of lunches for Michael's school trips. They'd taken everything. My son, my home, my place in the family narrative. But as I sat in my car watching them celebrate, I remembered something important. I pulled out my purse and found the folder I always kept there, the one containing copies of all my important documents. Inside was the property agreement from my divorce, the one Harold had signed so carelessly. "You can take the memories," I muttered, staring at the house. "But you'll never take what's still legally mine." The property deed might have Harold's name on it, but the ownership was split 50-50, and I'd never signed away my half. The next morning I called Mr. Beckett, the lawyer who'd handled my divorce. I'd kept his number all these years, though I'd never imagined I'd need his services again. "Margaret Hill," he said warmly when his secretary put me through. "It's been 3 years? How can I help you?" "I need to discuss my property rights," I said. "Specifically the house on Elm Street." There was a pause while he pulled up my file. Ah yes, the Hill residence. Interesting clause you added to that settlement. Very smart thinking, actually. They didn't buy me out, did they? No, Mr. Beckett confirmed, flipping through papers. According to our records, you still legally own 50% of that property. The mortgage is in Harold's name, but the deed shows joint ownership. Why do you ask? I thought about my son's wedding, about being treated like a stranger, about being erased from the narrative of my own life. I want to know my options, I said carefully. Well, as a 50% owner, you have several rights. You could demand the property be sold and the proceeds split. You could buy out Harold's half if you have the funds. Or what? Or you could sell your 50% stake to a third party. Harold would have no legal grounds to stop you. For the first time in days, I smiled. Tell me more about that last option. Mr. Beckett explained the process in detail. As a co-owner, you have the right to sell your share to anyone you choose. The new owner would become Harold's unwilling partner, which typically motivates the remaining owner to buy them out at fair market value. What's the current value of the house? I asked. I'll need to get it appraised, but given the improvements and the current market, probably around $400,000. Your half would be worth about $200,000. I thought about Harold's reaction when he discovered that his comfortable life with Samantha was about to be disrupted by a stranger who owned half their home. How long would this process take? If you're serious about this, Margaret, I could have the paperwork ready in a week. But I have to ask, are you sure you want to go this route? This could cause significant family drama. I remembered sitting alone at my son's wedding, watching another woman receive credit for raising my child. Mr. Beckett, I said firmly, they already started the war. I'm just choosing to fight back. In that case, let me make some calls. This is going to be very interesting. After I hung up, I sat in my small apartment and felt something I hadn't experienced in years: power. For the first time since my divorce, I wasn't reacting to Harold's choices. I was making my own. The woman they'd dismissed as weak and irrelevant was about to remind them who they were dealing with. 3 days later, Michael and Lauren showed up at my apartment for what they claimed was a check-in visit. I could tell immediately it wasn't social. Lauren's smile was too bright, Michael's hug too brief. We brought you some leftover cake from the reception, Lauren said, setting a small container on my coffee table like she was bestowing a great gift. I wanted to point out that I should have had wedding cake at the actual reception, but I bit my tongue. How was your honeymoon? I asked, though neither had mentioned they were going on one. We postponed it, Michael said. We want to get settled in the house first. Speaking of which, Mom, we need to discuss something. Here it was. The real reason for their visit. Lauren leaned forward with that practiced smile. It's about the property situation. Harold's lawyer says there's some paperwork issue with the house deed. What kind of issue? I asked innocently. Well, Michael looked uncomfortable. Apparently you still technically own half the house, which seems like an oversight from the divorce, right? You really should transfer your half to Dad. It's symbolic of moving on. It's not symbolic, I said calmly. It's legal. And it stays mine. Lauren's fake smile faltered for the first time. But Margaret, don't you think it's a little strange? I mean, you don't live there anymore. Strange that I'd retain ownership of property I'm legally entitled to? No, Lauren. What's strange is being told I don't matter by people living in a house I still own. After they left, Michael called me that evening. His voice was cold, nothing like the warm tone he'd used as a child when he needed comfort after a nightmare. Mom, Lauren's family thinks it's weird that you're still tied to our property. It's making things uncomfortable. Then maybe Lauren shouldn't have married into my family, I replied. It's not your family anymore, he said sharply. You're divorced. You're supposed to move on. I did move on, Michael. I moved to an apartment and started a new life. But that doesn't mean I forfeit my legal rights to make your new wife more comfortable. You're being petty. I'm being practical. That house represents 15 years of my life, 15 years of mortgage payments I helped make, 15 years of maintaining a home where I raised you. Just because your father remarried doesn't erase my contribution. Lauren thinks you're trying to cause problems. I felt something cold settle in my chest. My son was choosing his wife's comfort over his mother's dignity. Lauren thinks a lot of things, I said. Most of them are wrong. Mom, just transfer the deed. Please. For me. No, Michael. I won't sign away the only security I have left so that your wife can pretend I never existed. He hung up without saying goodbye. I stared at the phone for a long moment, then called Mr. Beckett. I've made my decision, I told him. Proceed with the sale. My best friend Evelyn came over that weekend, bringing coffee and pastries from our favorite bakery. She'd been my rock through the divorce and the lonely years that followed. You look different, she said, studying my face across my small dining table. Determined. I'm tired of being invisible, I said, explaining what had happened at the wedding and the conversation with Michael. Evelyn listened without interrupting, her expression growing angrier with each detail. 28 years, she said finally. 28 years you devoted to that boy, and this is how he repays you. He's not the same person I raised. Harold and that woman have poisoned him against me. So what are you going to do about it? I showed her the paperwork Mr. Beckett had prepared. I'm going to sell my half of the house to the highest bidder. Evelyn's eyes widened as she read the legal documents. Margaret, this is brilliant. They'll have a stranger as a co-owner. A stranger who'll want to either live there or sell the property for maximum profit. You don't get mad, Evelyn said, grinning. You get even. No, I corrected, thinking about all the years I'd stayed quiet, all the times I'd accepted being treated as less important than Harold's wants and needs. I get smart. That afternoon, I emailed Mr. Beckett my approval to proceed with finding a buyer. The next chapter of my life was about to begin, and this time, I was writing the story. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by certified mail to ensure someone would be home to sign for it. I imagined Harold's face as he opened the official-looking envelope over his morning coffee. I was watering plants on my apartment balcony when my phone rang. Harold's number appeared on the screen, and I let it go to voicemail. Then it rang again. And again. Finally, I answered. What the hell is this? He shouted without preamble. Good morning to you too, Harold. What is what? This letter. This notice about property sale. You can't do this. Actually, I can. And I am. Margaret, be reasonable. We've been living here for 3 years. Samantha has redecorated everything. This is our home. It's your home, I corrected. It's my investment property. There's a difference. Lauren's voice screeched in the background. She can't just sell our house. My half of your house, I said loudly enough for her to hear. The half I legally own and have every right to sell to whoever I choose. Who are you selling to? Harold demanded. The highest bidder, Mr. Beckett says there's significant interest from investors looking for rental properties in that neighborhood. The silence on the other end told me he was finally grasping the implications. A property investor would either want to live in the house themselves or convert it to rental units for maximum profit. Margaret, please. Let's work something out. We can buy your half. At current market value? That would be $200,000. Another silence. Harold had always lived beyond his means, and Samantha's expensive tastes had only made things worse. We don't have that kind of cash. Then I guess you'll be getting new roommates soon. Harold showed up at my apartment that evening, his face red with fury and desperation. I watched through my peephole as he paced outside my door, clearly working up the courage to knock. When I finally opened it, he pushed past me into my living room without invitation. You're destroying my family, he shouted. I'm exercising my legal rights, I replied calmly. You taught me the difference during our divorce. This is vindictive and cruel. You're punishing innocent people because you're bitter about the wedding. I almost laughed. Innocent? Harold, you and your wife had me erased from my own son's wedding. You let her take credit for raising Michael, while I sat alone in the back like a stranger. You're overreacting. Am I? When was the last time Michael called me just to talk? When was the last time I was invited to a family dinner? When was the last time anyone in your perfect little family treated me like I mattered? He shifted uncomfortably, because we both knew the answer was years ago. Samantha didn't mean anything personal by the wedding arrangements. She had the staff list her as Michael's mother, Harold. How is that not personal? You're twisting things. I walked to my desk and picked up a copy of the property sale agreement. The closing is scheduled for next Friday. The new owners take possession on the 1st of next month. Harold's face went pale. New owners? Plural. A property development company. They specialize in converting single-family homes into multi-unit rentals. He stared at me like he was seeing a stranger. You would really do this to your own son? My son made his choice when he decided I wasn't important enough to acknowledge at his wedding. Now he gets to live with the consequences. Harold slammed my door so hard the walls shook, but I felt nothing but calm satisfaction. The next morning, I walked into Mr. Beckett's office feeling more confident than I had in years. He greeted me with a mixture of admiration and concern. Harold called my office 6 times yesterday, he said, gesturing for me to sit. He's threatening to fight the sale. On what grounds? He claims you're not mentally competent to make this decision, that you're acting out of spite rather than sound judgment. I'd expected this. And what did you tell him? That a person exercising their legal property rights in response to being systematically excluded from family events sounds perfectly rational to me. Mr. Beckett opened a thick file folder. I have the final paperwork here. Once you sign, the sale is binding. Are you absolutely certain about this? I thought about the wedding, about being invisible, about watching another woman receive credit for my life's work. He said I'd regret this. I told Mr. Beckett. And will you? I smiled as I reached for the pen. Only because I'll miss watching their reaction when they realize what's happening. The signatures took less than 5 minutes. 23 years of marriage and 3 years of being treated as irrelevant, resolved with a few strokes of a pen. The buyers take possession in 2 weeks, Mr. Beckett said. Harold and his family have until then to vacate or negotiate a rental agreement with the new owners. As I walked out of his office, I felt lighter than I had in years. For the first time since my divorce, I was the one making decisions that affected other people's lives. It felt powerful and terrifying and absolutely right. The story broke on social media before I even had time to tell anyone what I'd done. Apparently, Lauren's Instagram following had noticed that her recent posts from the Hill family estate had suddenly stopped, replaced by vague references to temporary housing changes. Her influencer friends started asking questions in the comments. Why aren't you posting from your gorgeous house anymore? What happened to the brand partnership shoots you were planning? The truth came out when one of her followers recognized the for sale sign in a neighbor's photo of the street. Lauren's carefully curated image as the sophisticated wife living in an elegant family estate crumbled overnight. She built her social media brand around the lifestyle the house represented. And now that foundation was literally being sold out from under her. I found myself checking her Instagram account obsessively, watching as her follower count dropped and brand partnerships disappeared. Companies didn't want to associate with someone whose life was so publicly falling apart. The comments grew increasingly brutal. Guess your mother-in-law had the last laugh. This is what happens when you disrespect family. How embarrassing. Your whole aesthetic was fake. I should have felt sorry for her, but all I could think about was how she'd laughed about my dated dress and irrelevant presents at the wedding. Karma, it seemed, had excellent timing. Michael called me in tears 3 days before the closing date. Mom, please, he sobbed into the phone. The court officer served us the eviction notice today. We have to be out by the weekend. I heard. You heard? That's all you have to say? We're about to be homeless. You're about to learn what it feels like to lose the place you considered home, I corrected. I learned that lesson 3 years ago. This is different. Lauren and I are just starting our lives together. We don't have anywhere to go. Then perhaps you shouldn't have taken for granted the place you were living. It's our house, Mom. We've made it our home. It was never your house, Michael. It was your father's house and half of it was mine. You just chose to ignore that inconvenient fact. We can't afford to rent anything decent on short notice. Do you know how much security deposits cost? First and last month's rent. I thought about all the months I'd struggled to pay bills while Harold spent money on toys and Samantha redecorated with expensive furniture. You'll figure it out. Young people are resourceful. Mom, I'm begging you. Don't do this to us. I'm your son. Yes, I said quietly. You are my son. You're the little boy I raised by myself while your father was too busy to help. You're the child I worked 2 jobs to support. And you're the man who made sure I felt like a stranger at his wedding. I didn't know they were going to. You knew exactly what was happening, Michael. You just didn't care enough to stop it. The line went quiet except for his crying. You made your choice, son, I said gently. Now live with it. I decided to attend the estate auction, not out of cruelty, but because I wanted to witness the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The house looked smaller somehow, sitting empty with a cluster of cars in the driveway, and people wandering through the rooms with clipboards and measuring tapes. I'd printed a simple invitation on cream-colored cardstock. You're cordially invited to the auction of the Hill family estate, hosted by Margaret Hill, co-owner. I'd mailed copies to everyone who'd attended Michael's wedding. The turnout was better than I'd expected. Neighbors who'd watched the drama unfold, former colleagues of Harold's who'd heard about the situation through office gossip, and even some of Lauren's former friends who seemed to be enjoying her fall from grace. Harold and Samantha arrived just as the auctioneer was setting up his podium. They looked haggard, clearly having spent sleepless nights trying to figure out how to stop what was happening. Michael and Lauren pulled up in a rental car, their faces pale and shocked when they saw the crowd gathered on what used to be their front lawn. Lauren spotted me immediately and whispered something to Michael that made him scan the crowd until he found me standing calmly near the property markers. She's really going through with it, I heard Lauren say to one of her remaining friends. Yes, I thought. She really is. The auction itself was swift and efficient. 3 property development companies had submitted bids, along with 2 private investors looking for rental opportunities in the desirable neighborhood. I sat in a folding chair near the front, my bidding paddle resting on my lap, watching as the price climbed higher than anyone had expected. The final winning bid was $450,000, $50,000 more than the original appraisal. My half of the sale would net me $225,000, enough to buy my own small house with cash and have money left over for retirement. Harold's face grew paler with each bid increment. Even if he'd had the money to buy me out originally, he couldn't have afforded this price. When the auctioneer's gavel fell, making the sale final, I felt a chapter of my life close with a satisfying snap. Lauren burst into tears in the parking lot, her carefully applied makeup running down her cheeks. Michael put his arm around her, but kept glancing at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Several neighbors approached me as I walked to my car. Good for you, Margaret, said Mrs. Patterson from 2 houses down. We all saw how they treated you. It's about time someone stood up for themselves. That took real courage, added Mr. Wilson. Most people would have just accepted being pushed aside. As I drove away from the house for the last time, I realized I felt no sadness about losing it. It had stopped being my home the day Harold moved his new wife into the rooms where I'd raised my son. Now it was just a transaction, completed successfully. The aftermath was swift and brutal for Harold's carefully constructed new life. Lauren's influencer career collapsed entirely when brands realized her lifestyle content had been built on a foundation that was literally sold out from under her. The companies that had paid her to promote luxury products in her family estate demanded refunds when they discovered she was living in a budget motel. Harold's accounting firm lost their biggest client when the partner's wife learned about the wedding situation at her book club. Apparently, the story of a man who let his new wife erase his son's mother from family events didn't sit well with other women in their social circle. Michael, meanwhile, discovered that his father's promises of financial support had been based on the assumption that he'd eventually inherit a valuable property. With the house sold and the proceeds split, Harold had no nest egg to share with his son. I heard through neighborhood gossip that they'd moved into a small rental apartment across town. The 3 of them squeezed into 2 bedrooms while trying to rebuild their lives. Part of the money from my house sale went into a donation I made to the local women's shelter, earmarked specifically for their program helping mothers escape financial abuse. The rest went toward a small cottage near the lake, where I'd always dreamed of retiring. For the first time in my adult life, I own my home outright. No mortgage, no co-owners, no one who could take it away from me. Just me, my books, and the peace of knowing I'd finally stood up for myself. Michael found me at the lakeside park where I'd been reading on sunny afternoons. He looked thinner, older, like the stress of the past month had aged him years. "Mom," he said, sitting beside me on the bench without asking permission. "Hello, Michael." We sat in silence for several minutes, watching ducks paddle across the water, while children played on the nearby playground. "Why?" he finally asked. "Why did you do this to us?" I closed my book and looked at my son. Really looked at him, for the first time in months. "I didn't do anything to you, Michael. I stopped letting you do things to me. You ruined our lives. Lauren can't get work. Dad's business is struggling. We're living in a tiny apartment. And how do you think I felt when you erased me from your wedding? When you let another woman take credit for raising you? When you told me my feelings didn't matter because they made your wife uncomfortable?" He shifted on the bench, unable to meet my eyes. "You taught me that I didn't matter," I continued. "That I was disposable, replaceable, irrelevant. So I stopped acting like someone who didn't matter, and started acting like someone who did. But we're family. Family doesn't treat each other the way you treated me, Michael. Family doesn't let outsiders rewrite history to make themselves more comfortable. I never meant for you to feel." "Yes, you did. You meant for me to quietly disappear so your new life would be simpler. Well, congratulations. I disappeared from your narrative. I just took my assets with me." He left without another word, and I returned to my book, feeling oddly peaceful about the conversation. Some bridges were meant to be burned. The local newspaper picked up the story 3 months later, running a feature article titled, "Local Mother Reclaims Dignity After Wedding Snub." The reporter had done her homework, interviewing neighbors, wedding guests, and even some of Harold's former business associates. The picture she painted was of a devoted mother systematically erased from her son's life by a manipulative stepmother and weak-willed father. I read the article aloud to myself over my morning coffee, sitting on the deck of my new cottage overlooking the lake. Margaret Hill, 58, spent 28 years raising her son as a single mother while working multiple jobs to support his education and activities. Last spring, she was treated as a stranger at his wedding while her ex-husband's new wife was credited with raising the groom. Hill's response was swift and legal. She sold her half of the family home, netting enough money to buy her own property and donate generously to local charities supporting women in crisis. The article quoted several of my former neighbors praising my decision to stand up for myself. "It's about time someone fought back," Mrs. Patterson had told the reporter. That family treated Margaret terribly, and she had every right to protect herself. The story gained traction on social media, with thousands of comments from people sharing their own stories of family mistreatment and expressing support for my actions. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "We're sorry. Can we talk? Lauren." I deleted the message without responding and went back to my coffee. Some apologies come too late to matter. I drafted my response to Lauren's text carefully, not out of anger, but out of clarity. I wanted her to understand exactly why her apology was meaningless now. "Lauren," I wrote, "you made me invisible at my son's wedding. You took credit for raising a child you didn't meet until he was 25 years old. You convinced my son that my feelings didn't matter because they inconvenienced your vision of your new family. You taught him to choose your comfort over his mother's dignity. An apology doesn't undo 28 years of sacrifice being erased in one evening. You got the wedding you wanted, with the narrative you preferred. I hope it was worth the price you're paying now." I included a photo of my sold house with a simple caption. "Empty, just like the space you tried to create where I used to exist." I hit send and immediately blocked the number. An hour later, my phone rang. Michael's name appeared on the screen, but I let it go to voicemail. His message was brief. "Mom, Lauren is crying. She says you sent her something cruel. Please call me back. I deleted the voicemail without listening to it twice. My son was still more concerned with his wife's tears than his mother's pain. Some things, apparently, would never change. That evening, Evelyn came over for dinner. We sat on my deck watching the sunset paint the lake in shades of pink and gold. Any regrets? She asked. I considered the question seriously. I regret that it took me so long to realize my own worth. I regret the years I spent accepting less than I deserved. But do I regret standing up for myself? Never. 6 months after the auction, I was settled into a routine that felt like the life I'd always been meant to live. My cottage was small but perfectly suited to one person who'd spent decades catering to everyone else's needs. I'd joined a book club, started volunteering at the women's shelter, and taken up painting, something I'd always wanted to try but never had time for when I was working multiple jobs to support my family. Evelyn visited regularly, often bringing updates about Harold's family that she'd heard through mutual acquaintances. They had to move again, she reported during one visit. Apparently the apartment was too expensive and Lauren still can't find steady work. And Michael? Working 2 jobs from what I hear. Retail during the day, restaurant at night. I thought about my son learning what it felt like to work constantly just to make ends meet. The way I had for years while his father spent money on luxuries. Maybe it'll teach him something about hard work, I said. Maybe it'll teach him something about appreciating his mother. Evelyn replied pointedly. That afternoon, I received a letter from Michael, an actual handwritten letter, not a text or email. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a brief message. Mom, I understand now what you went through to raise me. I'm sorry it took losing everything for me to see how much you sacrificed. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that I finally get it. I read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and put it in my desk drawer. Understanding and apologizing were good first steps, but rebuilding trust would take much more than words on paper. This morning, I sat at my small writing desk overlooking the lake, signing a check to the women's shelter where I volunteer. The donation would fund their new program helping elderly women who'd been financially abused by family members. Because my story wasn't unique. Every week at the shelter, I met women who'd been manipulated, controlled, or erased by people who were supposed to love them. They thought I was fragile. I wrote in my journal. They thought being older meant being powerless, that loving my son meant accepting any treatment he chose to give me. But sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to disappear quietly. I sealed the check in an envelope and prepared to drive into town to deliver it personally. Before leaving, I turned to face the camera I'd set up on my bookshelf. After months of declining interview requests, I decided to tell my story my own way. My name is Margaret Hill, I said clearly. A year ago, I was made a stranger at my son's wedding by people who wanted to rewrite history for their own comfort. They erased me from their story, so I wrote my own ending. I paused, looking out at the lake where a blue heron was fishing in the shallows. Please subscribe if you found value in my story. Because some stories aren't about revenge. They're about remembering that self-respect is worth more than keeping the peace. They're about learning that sometimes love means setting boundaries, even with people who share your DNA. I turned off the camera and walked outside to tend my garden, where tomatoes were ripening in the morning sun, and flowers bloomed in colors I'd chosen simply because they made me happy. At 58, I'd finally learned to be the main character in my own life. And I'd never felt more free.